Hi, my name is Charlotte, and this channel is about my attempt to become moderately competent at art. This week, I'm going to be updating you on how my first steps into digital painting have gone. You can hear about my extremely limited history with digital painting in a previous video that I'll link below, but to be quite honest with you, that's literally 2.5 minutes of me going, I really don't know anything, I haven't really worked on this yet. It's probably useful context also to know that I have no real experience with traditional painting either. I've dabbled a little bit with watercolor and gouache, but I wouldn't call myself even minimally competent with either of those things. So really coming into digital painting with no painting experience or knowledge. My goal this year is to become minimally competent in 2 different digital painting platforms, Photoshop and Procreate. So I got started for real on the 1st of January. I embarked on following a course that I had bought months and months earlier from Control Paint called Rendering. Control Paint, if you're not familiar with it, is a website, one of the original websites for digital painting, run by a guy called Matt Core. He doesn't seem to be updating it anymore or adding new content, but there's still this very large library of free material that explains how to use Photoshop, and then also these paid-for short courses on major beginner topics in digital painting. So I started with rendering, like I said, and I bought the bundle, which contains 4 rendering courses and also 2 perspective courses, which I haven't touched yet. I also bought an additional module, which is intended as a kind of add-on to the rendering bundle, which is called Skill Drill Black and White Photo Studies. So those 5 things, the 4 rendering and the Skill Drill package, are what I worked on in January. And I would say the majority of the content is really platform free. I would say maybe 80 to 90% of it, you could use any piece of software with a little bit of work to figure out how to do some specific functions, and you would be completely fine. In fact, I would say a pretty large proportion of the course is completely medium independent, and you could do any kind of painting with it. There is some content which is like, this is how you use Photoshop, press this button now to achieve this outcome. But the vast majority of it is more like, this is how you paint. So if you're somebody who can already paint traditionally, I don't think you would find this course particularly useful. But if you're an absolute beginner like me, it's very effective. So the first piece of this is called Basic Photoshop Rendering. It falls a little bit more in the press this button now, this is how you use Photoshop end of things compared to the rest of the course, but not so much that I didn't find it really straightforward to transfer over to Procreate to do it. So the purpose of this course is just to introduce you to the workflow to do a detailed, realistic grayscale render. And you're given a sketch which is of a vase, and you're walked through the process of how to make these renders. But I did the Procreate render first, and this is how that turned out. And then I did it again almost immediately afterwards in Photoshop, and this is how this turned out. It's really interesting to me that I made different mistakes in each of these renders. I don't think my vases are great, but they're not bad for an absolute novice. It was also surprisingly absorbing. I'd be there rendering away, and then I'd look up and it'd be like 90 minutes had gone by and I hadn't really noticed. Having finished those, I moved on to rendering 2, which is called Imaginary Light and Shadow. The vast majority of the material in this module is, this is how to think about light and shadow. This is how to paint. There are 3 types of worksheets. I did 2 of them. I split my time between Photoshop and Procreate to complete these worksheets just to distribute my practice time. There was absolutely no problem doing that. You could have done these with anything. The worksheet that I didn't do was a very complex subject to apply light and shadow to, and I was just kind of at my limit for it at this point, so I moved on without completing that. Rendering 3 is called Realism, and it's also more theoretical and about how to paint, and less about Photoshop. Although one of the worksheets is extremely Photoshop dependent. The topics are things like contrast, texture, different lighting situations, indoors versus outdoors, and so on. I only did one of the exercises, which is the one Photoshop dependent one where you change the contrast of different items in the image to look at the way contrast changed the compositions. I also looked at the other exercises, but right now I felt like I just didn't have the bandwidth to keep going. So I actually took a few days off at this point, and while I was doing that, I watched the Rendering 4 videos. So part 4 is just a demo. It's Matt Core walking you through how he goes about creating a grayscale illustration. As he does so, he calls out each of the skills that he's using that he's previously demonstrated in previous sections of the course. I probably wouldn't have bought this if it hadn't come in the bundle, but it was actually really interesting to watch. It's just a really concise and straightforward way of talking about how value affects a composition. So the final thing I worked on was these black and white skill drills. So this module is a series of exercises where you use your own reference images and you create a series of value studies with different constraints. Again, mostly this is how you paint with very little Photoshop dependent material. The exception is one of the 5 skill drills is how to use adjustment layers in Photoshop. So exercise 1 is stroke economy, which is where you try to reproduce your reference image in no more than 10 brushstrokes. Here is one of my more successful ones of some pears on a plate. And when you're doing these fairly simple studies, the 10 brushstrokes is no problem at all. I tried to do a study of this photo of elephants in the jungle, and it was extremely difficult for me to make this readable as anything at all, let alone elephants, with just 10 brushstrokes. So I think I need to continue to practice these more complex images when I'm doing the studies in the future. So the constraint in exercise 2 is the number of values. So you can use as many brushstrokes as you like, but only 3 values, light, medium, and dark. Here are a couple of examples of the ones that I did so far, a lighthouse, and this one of a still life with oranges. In the third exercise, you take your original photos and your 3 value study and you expand it. So instead of having 3 values, you have 9. Here is the lighthouse study with the reference, the 3 value, and the 9 value. And here is the still life with oranges in the same order. I actually really loved this exercise. Working within these constraints makes it feel like a kind of game or a puzzle. So it was really fun to do it. I haven't done a lot of fully rendered work, but I really felt like this unlocked something in my brain for understanding how values work, and I'm going to continue to do these exercises as well. The fourth exercise is a Photoshop adjustment layer exercise, and I did not do this. And then the fifth exercise is a kind of final finished illustration. And again, I was just at my limit with this at this point, so I've put that on one side to come back to in the future when I've done more of the more simple studies. So overall, I think this was a really great module. I was really glad that I paid the extra for this extra little skill drill. So that's pretty much everything I did in January as far as learning digital skills. I would say overall the month was equal parts fun and frustrating. So using Procreate superficially is really easy. It's really user-friendly. But as soon as I needed to do anything remotely complicated, I was on Google looking stuff up, trying to figure out how to do things. And that added a lot of time and effort every single session, it felt like. And then Photoshop is just so unintuitive for a beginner. It has like 4 million menus and a million keyboard shortcuts, and doing everything feels really difficult. On the days where I was most frustrated, I would just remind myself that I'm dealing with 2 learning curves at the same time. I'm an absolute novice in painting, so I have this huge learning curve with painting. And then there's also a big learning curve with the software itself. So right now I have this kind of stacked learning curve. But the truth is, I know that the software learning curve will flatten out much faster, and I'll get to the point where I'm really comfortable using both of these platforms. And until then, the only thing you can do is just keep trudging up the learning curve until you get there. But there were other days where I was just like, oh, this is really fun, this is cool. I'm really pleased with the things that I'm doing, and I can't wait to get on to more complex subjects, my own illustrations, when I have a little bit more skill. So it's been a bit of a mixed month, but I think overall still really enthusiastic to go on with this in February. Since I had such a good experience this month with Control Paint, I decided to continue on with his courses, and I picked up the Control Paint Color Bundle to work through in February. I'm not expecting to do every exercise in the course of a single month, but I think I can probably get a start on each of the topics. And I'll be back to talk about how I've gotten on with that at the beginning of March. In the meantime, next week, I'm going to cycle back around to the beginning and talk to you about my continued adventures with portrait drawing. So I hope you have a great week, and I'll see you next weekend. Bye for now.